So, ads, you love them, right?
Well, what if they went away?
Today, we'll explore the question, is advertising obsolete?
What if chatbots, search, and blockchain gave power back to the consumer?
I'm Stephen Rosenbaum,
And I'm Gene DeRose. This is Future Forward.
and let us launch.
So we got a special guest with us today, our first special guest. We're hoping to do a lot more of this in the future. His name is Ramsi Woodcock. He's a professor of law at University of Kentucky.
All right, he's coming up midway through the show. And also excited to welcome our friends at IEEE Spectrum Magazine to Future Forward. IEEE Spectrum is the flagship magazine and the website of IEEE, the world's largest professional organization devoted to engineering and applied sciences. And we are excited to work with them on edit, and they're going to help the pod, and they're going to help spread the word. It's excellent to have them. Welcome, IEEE. All right, so
Welcome, guys.
no irony here that we've got our first partner coming on when we're talking about the end of advertising, because this is actually in some ways the future. But I wanna just begin with this question. Like, so the Atlantic had an article that was quite pointed and essentially said that media's post-advertising future is about to arrive. I was surprised at how searing it was.
Yeah, I mean, I think so, and I don't think it's news, and I think this stuff happens in an evolutionary way. I don't disagree with the sort of upshot of the searingness, but these are really weird times for advertising, media, and journalism.
So I want to jump into a controversy, because this, I think, plays well to the conversation that we're going to have with Ramsey. A whole bunch of big advertisers are pulling out of YouTube. And they're pulling out of YouTube because the headline is they're pulling out because of child pornography. But if you read below the fold, what they're really pulling out of is pictures of children playing on the beach. No, nothing sexual about them. And then people in the comments saying horrible sexual things about children. So it's not the content that the advertisers are uncomfortable with. It's the comments that sexualize what is essentially innocent video. I find myself wondering, like, that may be an unfixable problem for YouTube. How are they going to fix that?
Well, I think, and I actually find this specific version of the story much less important than just the overall plight, which is that there is so much content released so constantly with very little attention to standards. A, B, the state of how we access YouTube and how our kids or others might access YouTube is wide open and not manageable. And C, as you said, things like the comments are areas that even if YouTube kind of tried to clamp down editorial or forum management or things like that, it's hard to imagine they would be able to check everything. So this is, it's a little like Facebook and Twitter and the other social networks, except in a lot more vivid way.
Yeah, I guess I just think, one of the things I found myself thinking a lot about this week as we talked about advertising being obsolete is it may just be that the idea of putting messages in front of information that interrupts my reading is just an old-fashioned and now ready to be abolished idea.
Well, and I would say the way in which it's done on YouTube, and you've heard me gripe about this going back a long time, the awkwardness and the clunkiness with which those video ads and messaging are inserted in front of or behind these things, is terrible. But the point, I think, is it has to be managed somehow. And there's no editorial control that YouTube eventually, what started as this wealth of riches that overcomes all the problems and the shortcomings, is going to catch up with them. I really have a feeling. I used to not think this, but I think it's just become too much of a looming problem.
So one of the other headlines that comes up when you type in the word obsolete in advertising, it immediately is television ads. Are television ads obsolete? Are they gone? And if you think about Netflix, right? It wasn't that long ago that HBO was your subscription, or Showtime, but that was for movies. But television, whether it be news or long form or the Academy Awards, whatever, what was commercial supported. Now you've got Netflix, which has exploded, and for $11 a month, I get documentaries, I get things that are more topical, I get films, I get series, I get original programming, and no commercials.
Right. Yeah. Well, look, the standard way of, other than live event-related programming, when you think about it, things that don't have any reason to not be time shifted, whether you're binge watching or watching, a show from 5 years ago or 10 years ago, there really is, it's an even more of a force, right? It's just not anything that makes a lot of sense. I think that's one piece of it. The other piece of it is the nature of advertising itself has changed so much, right? It used to be broadcast one to many. Now it's interactivity. It's going to the website after. It's consumer generated stuff. And so that's a sort of a separate thing. But on television, and look, this is going to shape a lot of what you and I have talked about just last week with these video services, right? One of the reasons why they're going to try to do this week's Netflix competitor doesn't work.
So let's actually open the Pandora's box that I think makes this all controversial, because really, we're a tech show, we're talking about the future, and the making advertising obsolete maybe is a little bit rearview mirror-ish. But let's talk about AI. So there was a terrific post on Medium by Rob Lether.
By the way, a former colleague and analyst of mine.
Really?
Yeah, and he's become a big, really, really done great in the world of ad networks, and in particular recently checking the presence of ads digitally on your own feed.
So his thesis is artificial intelligence will make advertising obsolete. And I was attracted to the headline and got a chance to dig into it. And I think he makes a pretty damn good argument. I'm not going to lie.
Yeah. Well, I think that this is where it becomes a little semantic. And I've talked to him before about this. I don't disagree. I think a lot of this needs to be said, traditional advertising as we know it, right? Because the need to persuade and the need to make money off of those that would persuade by media owners, that's never going to change, in my opinion.
So let me tell you how broken advertising is. I'm changing the light fixtures in my master bath. So I spent 3 or 4 days Googling, looking at Amazon, found some light fixtures, ordered them. They're great. They came yesterday. They installed them today. Every single page I go to now has ads for light fixtures on it. And all I want to do is say to the AI, hi, I bought them. I'm done. So the idea that I could go to a robot and say, here's what I'm interested in. And I know I know the kind of light I'm looking for. I'm looking for the bulb base, all this, and have it go, here are some options for you. That would be fabulous. And by the way, Amazon does it poorly, by the way.
And right. Even the state of the art today, I think this is one of the issues we have, which is the incredible lack of intelligence in, ironically, early AI kind of platforms and widgets and things like that. It's just terrible to the point where why should you bother, right? How many times do you go onto a media consumption or renting or buying site and you already have read, seen, or whatever is being presented to you? You just didn't do it on Netflix, or you didn't buy it from iBooks. And so this is really, the nuances are lame. And look, the flip side is, if we're willing to give every bit of our privacy away and let that data be chewed on, sure. Are we ready for that?
So do you have conversations with chatbots? Do you know the difference between when you're talking to a chat engine and when you're talking to a human?
I don't claim to always know. I'm a little bit on the lookout for it at different times. There's a virtual assistant bot that Rob mentions in his article that he used and played around with. I used that for a while, and I delighted in letting the people I was trying to set up a lunch with or whatever watch them be completely oblivious as an email intersected and said, "Sorry, Gene's busy during that time. Can we try for some other?" It's yes.
So I find that the trickiest thing about chatbots as advertising is that there is a seamless handoff between if you're just trying to book an appointment, you get a robot. And then if you say, wait, I might have to fix, like, there's certain ways you can flag it so that all of a sudden the chat becomes more conversational and you realize a human's picked up.
Yeah, well, I think that's right. That's I think when we talk about advertising being obsolete, is it because we no longer will tolerate it, which is a lot of what we've been talking about? Is it because it really sucks, which is a little bit of what we're talking about with early AIs? Or is it because there are other more nuanced ways of doing things, right? And this is a big issue, this whole advertorial in the middle of your Facebook feed when you can't recognize when you're being advertised to or not. What you're asking for in a little way, I think, is better contextual advertising. But isn't that the most insidious kind?
So there's an Intango article. We'll put the links in the pod data, which talks about chatbots beating ads. And our guest coming up in just a minute, essentially his thesis is this idea that advertising is pervasive and valuable and part of the fabric of our lives and isn't going anywhere is a relatively new idea, and one that other parts of the world do not subscribe to. Which I found strangely refreshing because
and I think since we read the articles in advance, historically haven't other parts of the world, so communist, socialist countries, other places where there was less capitalism, right? I think it marries to that a little. But yes,
that's interesting. So all right, so let's jump into. We'll see if we can get our friend on the line, and we'll bring him into the conversation. Let me introduce Ramsi Woodcock. Ramsi is a lawyer and a law professor and a very, very bright guy. So Ramsi, welcome to Future Forward. Let me just start with an easy question. When you talk about advertising being obsolete and antitrust, is that meant to be provocative, or do you actually imagine it happening?
I do imagine it happening. I mean, sort of growing up in the United States, it can be hard to imagine a world without advertising. But up until very recently, and certainly still to this day in many countries, you don't have any commercial advertising at all. I mean, I remember when I first went to China in the 90s, you had very, very little advertising. Now, that's not exactly a way to sell no advertising by referring to an authoritarian dictatorship. But the point is, no, I mean, a world without advertising is not something that's sort of beyond the realm of imagination. It's something that exists in a lot of places. So I don't mean to be sort of science fiction-like in this proposal. And actually, as I was researching an article that I've written on the issue, I discovered that if we go back only 40 or 50 years, the vast majority of intellectuals and economists and so on in the United States were very opposed to advertising, and it's only really in the last generation and a half or so that a kind of national consensus seemed to arise that that advertising was good for society.
So maybe roll back and tell us the thesis. I mean, what was the premise of the article?
So you'd be probably surprised to discover that the reason for which economists tend to think that advertising is good for society, or have argued that it is over the last few decades, is the idea that it provides useful product information. And when you hear that, you immediately are like, what planet do these economists live on? Because we know that advertising is about a lot more than simply providing consumers with product information that they may not have had. But that's the only justification that economists have found for why it's good for the economy. And so as soon as you look at that and you then step back and realize that we're living in the information age, you put these two things together and you realize, wait a second, we live in an age in which we have free access to product information of almost any kind we could ever want. So what does advertising actually add to that? If I can go online and get 5,000 reviews offered up by actual users of a product for free on any number of review websites, why do I need to have advertising thrust upon me through Google AdWords and so on in order to provide me access with product information? If I want it, I can have it. So the economic justification for advertising, which is solely that it provides us with useful product information, has effectively been eliminated by the rise of the information age and the internet. And yet advertising has persisted Why? Well, it's not just some gross mistake. It's because advertising also has a manipulative, or what the economists call a persuasive function, and that's what's doing all the work. But economists agree that advertising in its purely persuasive form is not socially beneficial. It doesn't contribute anything to GDP. It just changes consumer preferences. In fact, gives consumers less control over the products that they consume, and therefore represents a net loss to society.
Yeah. I mean,
yeah, Gene, you have a bunch of friends in this space. Like, are you inviting Ramsey over to a cocktail party to have your
oh my God, 100%. He's at that dinner party with, Jesus Christ and Freud. But seriously, I do think I like the way you presented it and framed it, and it's the heart of the matter, which is persuasion. Even at a time going way back when, converting people to sales is the reason why people did it. Certainly going back 100 years or more in other forms of media, just informing them of what you did and where it was and how you could buy it and what the product was, information. I do find myself, and this is not so much a devil's advocate to you as much as sort of like trying to unpeel the onion layers, which is, in a world where so many products are commoditized and there are no differences kind of in the inherent element of what some of them are, informing on a deeper and a broader level, I guess the question is, would it still be in the hands of somebody selling something to do the informing, or what a new version of sharing what a product's attributes were, or somebody does customer service differently or offers this, like, that's a very pedestrian way to dive in here, but I do find in a world where media exists, what would they be doing? Stepping away completely from communicating? The advertisers.
They wouldn't. So obviously firms need to be able to get information about their products out, and it's the only reason why that information is available freely on the internet is because firms have been producing it. So obviously firms should have a right to provide the sort of basic amount of information about products that's necessary to make it possible for people to call that information up when they want it by doing searches. So you put product information on your own website, you give it to Amazon if they're selling your product so that they can put it in the product specs section. All of that is legitimate because that's information.
Right.
But that's really a very small part of what advertising does, right? And so beyond that, advertising moves from being purely informative and sort of economy expanding and becomes the anti-competitive threat that that identified it to be.
So when you put this out there, did anyone at the FTC reach out to you and say, Professor Woodcock, that's interesting, we'd like to hear more about that?
No.
That's a no.
But I am interested in what the response has been, because in the article post there's a couple hundred comments, and even though I know you published that off of your research 6 or so months ago plus, but what has the general response been, or has this been something that you've been talking about kind of for a while?
This is not something I've been talking about for a while. So I was at an academic conference about a year ago. I'm mainly an antitrust scholar.
Antitrust, Sherman, yeah.
Yeah, and so I hadn't thought a ton about advertising at all, or really the media connection. But I was at a conference that was devoted to sort of the future of media economics, and that's when I encountered these arguments that sort of the economic justification for advertising is the provision of product information, and I just put the two together.
Yeah.
And interestingly enough, so I wrote an article up and I submitted it to law journals, and the Yale Law Journal, which is probably the #1 ranked law journal in the country, oddly enough took an interest in it and published it. But beyond that, I've gotten really nothing but hostility with respect to the idea. It was actually incredibly difficult for me just to get that op-ed published, the one that you read. It took a lot of negotiating with the outfit that publishes it, and I've circulated the article quite a bit. But I think the notion in this day and age, after there's been this sort of cultural acceptance of advertising, which I think really has been almost complete since the 90s. Right. The notion that there'd be a reason to get rid of it is sort of anathema to just about everybody.
Right.
By the way, just to be clear, when you say it was difficult to publish, the Fast Company reprint wasn't difficult. It was the original.
It was the original, just getting it out there to begin with. But I actually, I mean, I had, New York Magazine initially was interested in it, and then they, they cut it at the last moment. So there was, yeah. So there, you could sort of tell that this was an idea.
Well, for publishers to publish your article is the definition of biting the hand that feeds you, isn't it? I mean, right? I mean. Right. And part of, frankly, what I'm enjoying about having you on the pod is that I think this idea is inherent. The idea that advertising as it currently exists is a good thing. Objectively, not a lot of people would sign off on that, right? I mean, and if you look at Netflix as an example, right, you can see behaviors where television used to totally be controlled by advertising, and now people pay $7 or $11 a month to Netflix, and one of the things you buy is quality programs, and one of the other things you buy is no ads, right? So that the idea that something existed doesn't mean that it isn't going to change, and I think you're kind of on the cutting edge of that.
Yeah. Well, it reminds me a little of kind of like healthcare debates, which is that, it would be great if we had universal healthcare, but how do you practically kind of, rejigger everything with all the powers that be in place? And I like the fact that you're not just talking about some intellectually radical concept. You believe it's something that's possible. I do feel like the sort of what would the steps be, what might it look like in the future, which is less intellectually interesting, is also really interesting and would get a little bit more of an ear. Are you familiar with things like media literacy and the history of sort of getting people to understand when they're being advertised or marketed to, or is that just kind of too much in the middle of just?
Yes. No, that's something I'm not very familiar with at all.
Yeah, and it's funny, the brief history of it is that when there were smaller number of networks and lots of controls and fear of monopoly in this country, they didn't call it media literacy, but there were certain amount of modalities that had to be represented in a right way, with ads and things like that. The kind of stuff we're most familiar with, that is the footnotes of political ads or that you see in pharma ads, is something that in Europe and in democratic socialist kind of countries, it almost goes to a curriculum level of informing kids and making it a part of, but that's a very soft kind of thing, right? It's about, how to understand when you're being emotionally manipulated versus it shouldn't be allowed.
Yeah, and I share that view that there's something soft about it, right? So the fundamental part of my position on this is that we shouldn't be distinguishing between what is called in the law false and misleading advertising and what we would call non-false, non-misleading but persuasive advertising.
Yeah.
Right. Both involve a certain amount of manipulation. So the argument here is, any ad, simply through repetition, can change your preferences, right? Can make something more familiar than something else, such that when you go to the supermarket aisle, you're more likely to pick it than you are to pick other things, not because you have any rational basis for choosing it other than the fact that you've simply seen it more, right? You could have repetitive advertising, which is non-misleading in the legal sense. It's not a misstatement of fact, so it's not false advertising, and yet it has a manipulative effect on us.
Well, the very notion of branding as a label that is really about attributes and emotional and contextual softness, right, has nothing to do with. It's everything but the blocking and tackling.
And the interesting thing about this is that economists have for 100 years recognized that this persuasive aspect exists and is not good for the economy, because a market economy runs on the idea that consumers are sovereign, that they're imposing their preferences on the market. So when they make purchase decisions, those purchase decisions accurately represent their preferences, and firms therefore have to follow them through price signals. Otherwise, they'll go out of business. But when the firm can change those preferences, then the firms are dictating to the market instead of the market dictating production signals to the firms. And that reduces the ability of the economy to actually respond to our preferences and to provide us with the maximum that we should be able to get. And so So there shouldn't be this distinction between false and misleading advertising and purely persuasive. But we've never been able to attack it because we always knew that combined with our persuasive advertising, there was also useful product information. And we did need consumers to be informed. Right. The brilliant thing, I think, about today is that we no longer have to have that anxiety that the persuasive advertising also contains a kernel of useful product information that makes it essential for the economy to function. And so we can finally get at it in the same way that we used to get at that we still today get at false and misleading advertising.
So we have just like 2 minutes left. I have to ask, has anyone reached out to you positively? Has anyone said, hey, let's learn more about this? Or has it literally just been, because some of the comments on the article were essentially like, go away, you're bothering us.
So interestingly enough, the people who have reached out to me and have shown the greatest interest are people in the advertising industry.
Right.
So I've gotten, people running advertising companies reach out to me. I've got advertising lawyers reach out to me. I've got people who are in the industry who interestingly enough, seem to find it most relevant. It's people in the economics profession, people in the broader legal profession, the antitrust regulators who think that this is sort of a wingnut argument. But interestingly enough, not the industry itself.
So
wow.
so we're going to be doing a panel together at South by Southwest. Have you prepared some examples or some obviously you started the article talking about the Russian meddling in Facebook, which is a red hot topic now. I mean, it seems like your idea becomes more relevant as people understand that advertising is being used to manipulate voters, to manipulate ideas, to fake controversies within the democracy. It seems like, if it really is going to be run amok and unfixable, then maybe we should start to think about a way to diminish it.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, the interesting thing about the Russia hacking investigation is it has made people aware of the fundamentally manipulative character of advertising in a way that for a generation or so, that seemed to sink away when everybody was taking, delight in Super Bowl commercials and so on, and starting to view advertising as an art form into itself. Now we're starting to remember that there is a dark side to it. But the question is, and I think it's very much an open question, is whether that recognition is going to actually jump the line from recognizing it in the political advertising sphere to recognizing that all of commercial advertising is essentially aimed at the same thing.
Well, yeah, and I would just as a final point to throw in there, and media and even journalism itself becomes kind of complicit in this, or the overlaps become hard to manage, right? Because a lot of what gets presented, especially in these digital interactive modes, are little pieces of persuasion, I guess, or information, and you don't know the sources, you don't know the authority, relatively speaking, you don't know whether it's InfoWars or the New York Times or a Facebook news feed. This is the same kind of thing. So I do feel like fact checking and
there's something absurd about the fact that journalism and newspapers, which are dedicated to producing an informed, unmanipulated public,
objective, yeah,
would be getting their revenue for generations now from giving corporations space to manipulate the public. I mean, there's something odd about the fact that you'd have these two functions subsisting on the exact same newspaper page.
It's a form of original sin. It really
Ramsi,
is.
Thank you so much. We will see you in Austin in 2 weeks and look forward to a frothy, fun, and hopefully controversial conversation. And
good luck with it. I love the article and the research too. Thanks.
All right. We'll talk soon.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks.
So Gene, I was hoping that he would be fabulous, but he was even more like, he's not joking. Like, he's serious as a heart attack. He wants ads to go away.
And it's not just a philosophical kind of revolution rant. He believes it's something that could be done. The toothpaste can be put back in the tube.
I think we should set up a Patreon account for him.
That's interesting. Look, it's very hard with somebody like that who's so brilliant and is so conceptual, but even though he's realistic about it, the tendency in my banal, simple mind is to get into the sort of nuts and bolts of what it would actually look like to, to re-peel the, re-put the layers back on the onion to get it done. And I do think, and also to challenge some of the issues that one of the things I would have liked to have asked is, so does checking reviews on Amazon count? Or is that too inclined to be subjective?
All right, so a plug for our Austin South by Southwest panel. It is going to be 4 guests. Baratunde Thurston will be the moderator. He's terrific. He describes himself now as a pro-democracy activist. Tracy Lee is the product design director at the New York Times, talking about how ads fit into their future. I'll be there talking about social impact media, and Ramsi Woodcock, who we just heard from, will be there as well. It promises to be quite controversial, and I think will sell out. So it's March 8th, which is a Friday, and it's 11 a.m. And if you are in Austin and planning to come to South by Southwest, we would love to see you there.
And what we should also do is right before or on our website or something, we should give a link for those that might want to live stream or catch it afterwards, since I assume that kind of thing is done in these modern times.
I do not know the answer, but we will find out. Meanwhile, we're going to leap forward. We will be back again next week for another episode of Future Forward, and our friends at IEEE will be with us next week as well, and some of their stories will be part of the pod. So until then, party on.
Party on.